So again, I want to just start by saying what this title is, right? The title of this presentation, which is Less Than Human: Guantanamo Bay, Guantanamo North, and the Criminalization of Muslims in the War on Terror. So we often talk about this concept of dehumanization, right? And dehumanization of Muslims. But we don't really think about how specifically it's happening and how that contributes to the violence that is perpetrated against Muslims. So what I want to do in my talk today is to talk about the theory of dehumanization and identify particular ways that Muslims have been dehumanized in the war on terror. So whenever I start a talk, I usually like to start with a quote. So this quote was said by President Bush in 2006. He said that, quote, "If there's any comparison between the compassion and decency of the American people and the terrorist tactics of extremists, it's flawed logic. It's just, I simply can't accept that. It's unacceptable to think that there's any kind of comparison between the behavior of the United States of America and the action of Islamic extremists who kill innocent women and children to achieve an objective." So from the beginning, we see with this very quote, right, that there is a clear distinction that he is trying to make in terms of the violence that's employed by the United States and the violence that's employed by Muslims. He's trying to make it clear that there's a substantive difference between what the United States does and what these Islamic radicalists, terrorists, whatever you want to call them, does, right? And so by positioning these two groups in opposition, he's trying to highlight the fact that this group is barbaric, we're not. And no matter what we do, there's never going to be a comparison. It's never going to be a fair comparison because we're inherently more superior. So when I think about the ways that this has manifested itself, I think of some of the opinion polls that have been done in the last 14, 15 years. So in 2014, there was an opinion poll by Washington Post/ABC, and the question was, all in all, do you think the CIA's treatment of suspected terrorists was justified or unjustified? 59% said that it was justified, okay, which is a huge number. Obviously, we can look at issues of, whether or not it was a representative sample, all the methodological issues, but the point is, in this particular sample, 59% of those surveyed said it was justified. And that is a huge number. And think about the question itself, okay? We're no longer asking, is it moral or immoral? Because that doesn't apply to Muslims. We're asking, is it justified, right? Had we asked about it being justified for other populations, we would presumably get something different, depending on who the other population is, of course. But with this specific marginalized population, the question is about justification. And another thing is that the poll asks, they say the CIA's treatment of suspected terrorists. What was that treatment? How would any reasonable person define the treatment that was described in the report? Torture. So, when I think more largely about the issue of the dehumanization of Muslims, I referred back to the stages of genocide, which was outlined by an individual named Greg Stanton in 1996. Now, when you bring up the word genocide, it's often thought of as an extreme use of a word to define what is happening now with Muslims. But there's stages, and the important thing is that there's stages. And I also want to mention something very specific about the use of genocide. There was a report by the Physicians for Social Responsibility in 2015, in March of 2015, where they estimated that the death toll in the war on terror between Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan was 1.3 million. That's the number of lives that have been lost in the war on terror. And that's an estimate, a low estimate. So think about that in terms of why it makes sense to talk about genocide in the context of the war on terror. So the first step in the stages of genocide is classification. We have this us versus them binary. And that was repeatedly reinforced throughout the language, in particular of President Bush. You're either with us or against us. These people are not like us. Our violence cannot be compared to those of the Muslim extremists. Next step is the idea of symbolization. So there has to be some way of identifying this group, right? Whether you're talking about the Jews, whether you're talking about blacks, etc. There's a way of identifying a group that's being targeted and is on the path to genocide, to being inflicted by a genocide, right? So there's this idea of using the Muslim identity. The Muslim identity is used to distinguish this group. Now, the complicating factor for me when I was thinking about this is that we often would naturally think that it's about a Muslim's physical appearance, right? But in my mind, the physical appearance and the manifestation of violence in terms of their physical appearance is because of the ideology that they are thought to ascribe to. And the ideology of a Muslim is seen as inherently violent. And subscribing to a violent Islam is something that becomes rather genetic. And then the next step is dehumanization, right? So the use of hate propaganda, use of animal metaphors, and again, this ideology that adhering to Islam makes Muslims inferior because Islam is a fundamentally barbaric, dangerous, violent religion. So we can imagine, right, what it means to dehumanize a group of people. But there's something I want to consider as a larger part of this discussion, and that's the idea of moral exclusion. So this idea of moral exclusion comes from a scholar named Susan Apatow. She says that moral exclusion occurs when individuals or groups are perceived as outside the boundary in which moral values, rules, and considerations of fairness apply. Those who are excluded are perceived as non-entities, expendable, or undeserving. Consequently, harming or exploiting them appears to be appropriate, acceptable, or just. Now, this definition and idea of moral exclusion helps us to understand many aspects of dehumanization of Muslims. And it also helps us to refer back to that opinion poll where 59%, again, justified the CIA's treatment of the detainees. As long as we have successfully excluded these individuals from our moral community, it is acceptable to harm them. So with Muslims in particular, we see, of course, this idea of Islamophobia, a sort of distinct anti-religious animus at the nexus of xenophobia. And it's always really hard to describe what exactly are Muslims facing? What are the various factors that are leading to them being targeted? Is Islamophobia the appropriate term? Is it anti-Muslim racism? Is it anti-Muslim bigotry? For the sake of brevity and to actually end this talk in an appropriate amount of time, the definition that I have found to be most appropriate is one that was proposed by the Berkeley Center for Race and Gender. So the definition is as follows. Islamophobia is a contrived fear or prejudice fomented by the existing Eurocentric and Orientalist global power structure. It is directed at a perceived or real Muslim threat through the maintenance and extension of existing disparities in economic, political, social, and cultural relations, while rationalizing the necessity to deploy violence as a tool to achieve civilizational rehab of the target communities. Now, one of the reasons I think this definition of Islamophobia is the strongest is because it not only describes what this phenomenon is that we're seeing in terms of Muslims being targeted, but it also suggests a goal or an aim. Other definitions of Islamophobia talk about what it is. Muslims are being targeted, Muslims are being discriminated. But why are they being targeted and discriminated? And this particular definition offers some explanation of why it is, why this is the case. And with the idea of civilizational rehab, right? Civilizational rehab implies that your culture is superior and that we need to rehabilitate the inferior culture, that being Islam and its followers, Muslims. So what exactly is dehumanization, right? There's various definitions, but essentially when we think about what dehumanization is, it's treating others as subhuman, that they lack human qualities, that they're, in this case for Muslims, they're expendable, they're dangerous, and the goal of dehumanizing another group is to prove that they're fundamentally different in substance, right? They're not just less than us, they're fundamentally different. And our differences cannot be reconciled in a way that allows us to include these people in our community of human beings. And why does that matter? Because when the thought of violence or the threat of violence comes up, it's important for your victims and subjects to be dehumanized. It's not easy to corral support, to inflict violence, to perpetrate violence at this level without massive support. And the way that support is gained is through dehumanizing, in this case, again, Muslims. Am I good on time? Okay. So I'm going to talk about a few of the ways that I've identified Muslims being dehumanized. So I'm sure all of us in this room can remember the Abu Ghraib scandal, where pictures surfaced and contained brutal images, disgusting images of Muslims being tortured in the most egregious of ways. Nonetheless, Rush Limbaugh, and he's not necessarily a representative of the American public or anything like that, but I just want to give his quote by virtue of an example. With respect to the Abu Ghraib scandal, he stated that, quote, "They are the ones who are perverted. They are the ones who are dangerous. They are the ones who are subhuman. They are the ones who are human debris, not the United States of America, and not our soldiers, and not our prison guards." So in essence, Muslims cannot even exist as victims. Muslims are not allowed to be victims. And following the logic of dehumanization, they're not victims because they're not human. We don't consider animals as victims of violence. And this is a very problematic quote, and it's just one of many that I could have selected for this presentation. Interestingly enough, when I was researching this topic of dehumanization, some of the literature pointed to, well, there's actually a role that's played by dehumanizing perpetrators. So we saw with the first quote, the idea was to dehumanize the perpetrators, right? That they're different from us. And if you dehumanize the perpetrators, it follows logically that you can then dehumanize the victims. So for example, there was an article by Colleen Rowley in which she talked about why is it that Americans have a more visceral reaction to beheadings than drones. She speculated various reasons for that, but it's interesting to note that the beheadings are seen as a more serious and egregious human rights violation, although drones, the use of drones literally blow people up. The only difference is that we don't see this on camera. We don't see this on video. But think of the gruesomeness of a human being blown up by a drone, but yet we don't have this visceral reaction. Moreover, when it comes to crimes committed by the US government, it's not policy, it's a few rogue actors, right? Whereas with Muslim perpetrators, it's just who they are. Their very nature means that they should commit acts of violence. So I'm going to try to run through this quickly. But there's a book called At War with Metaphor, Media, Propaganda, and Racism in the War on Terror. And they talk about some of the very dehumanizing language, right? Things like using hunt, trap, snare, net, corral, words that are typically used when speaking about animals. So, some examples of article titles that have emerged since 9/11 include the following: Terror Hunt Snares 25, Net Closing Around Bin Laden, Pentagon Aims to Smoke Saddam Out, Terror Nest in Fallujah is Attacked, Of Monsters and Muslims, How Feds Snared Fort Dix Terror Plotters, Al-Qaeda Mutating Like a Virus. In a similar vein, Senator Alan Haynes said the following: when you were a child, did your parents have you vaccinated against different diseases? That was a preemptive gesture on their part, for which I would hope you're very thankful. And this is very similar to that, referring to Sharia law. Your mom and dad would not want you to get sick from one of those dreadful diseases, and I don't want any American in Florida to have their constitutional rights violated by any foreign law. So I think another important thing to consider is that Muslims are also dehumanized in terms of the way their anger is interpreted. So typically, when there's an act of violence, or when Muslims are expressing some sort of anger related to, more than likely, Western intervention, their anger is not situated in a context. It's as if we don't know, we're not willing to know why it is that this group is reacting the way that they are. We say things like they're against modernism and secularism as concepts. That's not about what have those concepts led to in a practical way. It's about they're just inherently opposed to these democratic normative ideals. Moreover, there's an idea that terrorists cannot be rehabilitated, right? Because terrorists are terrorists. It's who they are. And when I was doing my dissertation research, one of the quotes that surfaced was the following. It was about the Marines urinating on dead bodies. So this person said, for example, that story about the Marines. Marines urinating on dead bodies. It's not even the way it's usually talked about, and everybody will say it's deplorable, and this is not something that the US military does. But at the same time, they always talk about how it's going to be used as propaganda. But that's really frustrating because, it's always linked to Muslims engaged in unreasonable behavior. So again, we see the theme of Muslims cannot be victims, and again, that their anger is unreasonable. That we're going to shift the lens of the story to focus not on this act of war, a war crime, but we're going to focus on placing Muslims as individuals who cannot control their anger. Okay. So I'm running behind on time. So the last thing I'll say is really to talk about dehumanization in terms of Muslims existing outside of the law. So since 9/11, in particular, there have been numerous policies designed and implemented that place Muslims outside of the law. With Guantánamo Bay, for example, which my colleague will elaborate on, we saw this use of the term unlawful enemy combatants, and the idea that the Geneva Conventions don't apply. With Omar Khader, a child who was captured in Pakistan, the Convention on the Status of the Child didn't apply. Because again, legal rules and norms do not apply to Muslims. They are not human beings in the sense that they deserve legal rights. And there's specific other ways that this has happened, right? Guantanamo Bay itself is on illegally occupied land. Communication management units violated federal protocol in terms of what is typically done when a prison is going to open. They didn't publish the proposed rules. They didn't publish or ask for public commentary, which is typical. And I think the last thing I'll say is that with this idea of why are we not closing Guantanamo Bay, the idea that surfaces time and time again is that there's going to be a chance of recidivism. Now, keep in mind that the definition of recidivism is a return to criminal behavior. Using that word implies, even with those who have committed no crime, that they have committed a crime. How are you going to close a prison if you believe you're releasing criminals? And again, this idea of recidivism, that they're going to return to a life of crime if they were never involved in any crime. And is that a justification or a reason for continuing to detain these individuals? Because of the possibility that they might commit crimes. Is that ever a reason for which an individual should be held in prison? No, it's not. And so I will end here by saying that this issue of dehumanization and the ways in which it has specifically impacted the Muslim community is extremely important to understand. It's extremely important to understand how Muslims have been marginalized from society, the ways in which the government has implemented policies to position them as outside of the community of legal boundaries, and how the community has responded by expelling these individuals, this Muslim community, from who they consider to be their moral community, where consequently harming them and exploiting them is justifiable. And so we're here this week to call for an end to all of this. And in doing that, it's important and imperative for us to understand the underlying dynamics. Thank you.